In a secluded mansion, a boy born deaf lives under the strict control of his father, a man obsessed with perfection. The arrival of a new housekeeper sparks a silent connection between the two, shattering the solitude that surrounds them. But a dark secret that threatens the boy's life will put everyone in danger, forcing choices that will change their lives forever. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Let's continue. I promise, this is going to be the best story you've ever heard. The mansion stood like a monument to success and solitude in the heart of the Upper East Side in New York City. Its white walls reflected the afternoon sun, while the perfectly manicured gardens surrounded the property with the precision of someone who wouldn't tolerate a single branch out of place. Behind the wrought iron gates and security cameras lived Robert Miller, a man who had conquered the business world with the same relentless determination he brought to each new day. As the owner of one of the country's largest real estate development firms, Robert had turned concrete and steel into a fortune that could buy almost anything. Almost. What his money couldn't buy was his son's voice. Gabriel, 10 years old, deaf since birth, inhabited the mansion like a silent ghost, gliding through the wide hallways without a sound, never disturbing the meticulous order his father imposed on every inch of the place. Robert had never accepted the boy's condition as final. For years, he had dragged Gabriel to medical specialists across the country and abroad, from New York to the Mayo Clinic, from London to Zurich, always searching for an expert who could promise the miracle the previous ones had failed to deliver. Each trip ended the same way, with Robert more frustrated and Gabriel more exhausted, carrying the weight of an expectation he could never meet on his small shoulders. The routine in the mansion followed a rigid protocol, established by Robert himself and enforced with an iron fist by Mr. Peterson, the butler who had served the family for over 20 years. The staff, about 15 in all, received clear instructions from day one: absolute silence in the hallways, no unnecessary conversation, and no interaction with Gabriel that wasn't strictly necessary. Robert believed that if his son couldn't hear the world shouldn't make noise around him. It was a twisted logic, born of frustration and the desire to control what he knew. Deep down, he never could. The result was a house that felt more like a museum than a home, where every object had its exact place, and every person performed their function in silence like parts of a cold, efficient machine. Gabriel had learned to read the world in other ways. He felt the vibrations of footsteps on the marble floors, distinguishing who was approaching by their cadence and weight. He watched people's lips with intense focus, deciphering words even when they weren't directed at him. He sensed changes in the air, in the temperature, in the light that streamed through the immense living room windows. His universe was made of details others ignored, of signals only he could interpret. But none of it filled the void that grew inside him every day. It was a void made of loneliness, the kind that can't be cured with expensive toys or rooms decorated by renowned architects. Gabriel missed something he couldn't even name, something he saw in the movies he watched alone in the private home theater, something that existed between people but never reached him. Robert, for his part, had thrown himself into his work as a way to escape the reality he couldn't change. He spent his days locked in his office on the ground floor of the mansion, managing multi-million-dollar contracts, approving projects, and expanding his empire. At night, he dined alone in the formal dining room, served in silence by staff who appeared and disappeared like shadows. Gabriel ate in his room, accompanied only by the television and the books that piled up on his shelves. Father and son lived in the same house, but in separate worlds, connected only by blood and a silent pain neither knew how to express. It was on a March afternoon, when the New York heat lingered despite the approaching spring, that Julia Williams walked through the gates of the Miller mansion for the first time. She came from Millersburg, a small town in rural Pennsylvania, carrying everything. She owned in an old suitcase and in her heart the urgency of someone with no other choice. Her mother, Mrs. Davis, suffered from a heart condition that required constant treatment and medication far too expensive for the family's tight budget. Julia had worked as a nanny and a cleaner since she was 16, but the wages back home barely covered the basics. When the opportunity to work in New York City came up, through a distant cousin who knew someone who knew Mr. Peterson, Julia didn't hesitate. The salary was 3 times anything she had ever earned, and the chance to help her mother was worth any sacrifice. Entering the mansion for the first time, Julia felt the physical impact of the place. The beauty was undeniable, every detail designed to impress, from the crystal chandelier that dominated the foyer to the works of art that adorned the walls. But something was wrong, something she couldn't immediately define. It took her a few minutes to realize it was the silence. Not a natural silence of peace or tranquility, but an imposed, heavy, almost oppressive silence. The staff members who passed in the hallways avoided eye contact, greeted each other with minimal nods, and disappeared behind closed doors. It was as if everyone was walking on thin ice, afraid one wrong step would make everything shatter. Mr. Peterson, a tall, thin man in his 60s, led Julia through the main corridors, explaining her duties in a low, formal tone. She would be responsible for cleaning and organizing the second floor, where Gabriel's and Robert's bedrooms were, along with a few sitting rooms and the library. The rules were numerous and specific: strict schedules for each task, designated cleaning products for every surface, detailed procedures for arranging each object. But the most important rule, emphasized by the butler with a stern look, was about Gabriel. You are not, under any circumstances, to interact with the boy beyond what is strictly necessary, Mr. Peterson said, stopping in the second-floor hallway and turning to face her. Mr. Miller is very clear about this. Gabriel requires a controlled environment without unnecessary stimuli. Any inappropriate contact could result in immediate dismissal. Is that understood? Julia nodded, swallowing the questions that rose in her mind. It wasn't her place to question the rules of the house, not when she needed this job so badly. But as Mr. Peterson continued to explain the details of her tasks, Julia couldn't stop thinking about the boy who lived here, isolated by his own father's command. She remembered her nieces back in Millersburg, always surrounded by cousins, friends, noise, and mess. What would it be like to grow up in a house where even the staff were forbidden to smile at you? The first encounter between Julia and Gabriel happened 2 days later, completely unexpectedly. It was mid-morning, and Julia was cleaning the second-floor library, carefully wiping down the spines of the books, when she noticed a movement in the window's reflection. She turned slowly and saw the boy standing in the doorway, watching her with dark, intense eyes. Gabriel wore a navy blue t-shirt and grey sweatpants, his bare feet silent on the Persian rug. Julia froze, remembering Mr. Peterson's warnings. She didn't know whether to greet him, ignore him, or leave the room. For a few seconds, they just stood there, looking at each other. It was Gabriel who broke the standoff. He walked to one of the shelves, picked up an illustrated book about marine animals, and sat on the floor, carefully opening the pages. Julia realized he wasn't there for her, but for the library itself, which seemed to be his refuge within the mansion. She decided to continue her work, moving slowly and silently, respecting the boy's space. From time to time, she cast discreet glances in his direction. Gabriel was completely absorbed in the images of whales and dolphins, tracing their outlines with his finger, as if he could feel the texture of the sea through the paper. When she finished cleaning that section of books, Julia needed to move to the other side of the library, which inevitably meant passing near Gabriel. She approached carefully, trying not to startle him, but the boy looked up before she got close. For an instant, their eyes met, and Julia saw something in his that hit her like a punch to the gut. It was loneliness, pure and profound, the kind she knew well. The loneliness of someone who knows they're alone even when surrounded by people, who has learned not to expect anything from anyone. Julia didn't think. She just acted. She smiled. A genuine, warm smile, the kind you offer a friend. Gabriel froze as if he didn't know how to react to such a simple gesture. For a moment it looked like he might smile back, but then he quickly averted his gaze, returning his attention to the book. Julia continued her work, but something had shifted inside her. That boy needed much more than cleaning and order. He needed someone to see him as a child, not as a problem to be managed. The following days established a silent routine between them. Gabriel started appearing in the library whenever Julia was there, bringing his books and toys and sitting in the same corner. He never tried to talk, never asked for attention. He just existed in the same space as her. Julia respected his quiet presence, working in silence, but gradually she began to make small gestures. She would leave a glass of orange juice on the small table beside him, as if it were part of her duties. She arranged Gabriel's books so that his favorites were easier to reach. One morning she found a small wooden toy car that had fallen under an armchair, clearly forgotten. Instead of just putting it back on the toy shelf, Julia left it discreetly next to Gabriel's books like a silent gift. Gabriel noticed, of course. He picked up the car and examined it for a long time, turning it over in his small hands, testing the wheels. Then he looked up at Julia, who was pretending to be busy fluffing the sofa cushions. For the first time, the boy didn't quickly look away. He just stood there holding the car, looking at this woman who treated his belongings with care, who neither ignored nor pressured him. And then it happened. Gabriel smiled. It was a small, shy smile that lasted only a few seconds before he turned his attention back to the toy. But it was real, genuine, and Julia felt her heart ache in her chest. Mr. Peterson, however, soon noticed that something was happening. During a routine inspection of the second floor, he caught Julia and Gabriel in the library, she organizing books while he drew on the floor. Technically, nothing was wrong. Both were silent, each engaged in their own activity. But the butler saw the proximity, the way Gabriel seemed comfortable in her presence. That was exactly the kind of thing Mr. Miller had forbidden. "Miss Williams, I need a word with you," Mr. Peterson said, his sharp voice breaking the library's silence. Julia stood up immediately, her heart racing. Gabriel looked up too, his eyes wide with concern. Mr. Peterson gestured for her to follow him, and Julia had no choice but to obey, casting one last look at the boy before she left. In the hallway, far from Gabriel's ears, which wouldn't have heard anyway, Mr. Peterson got straight to the point. "I warned you about the rules of this house. Mr. Miller does not want the staff forming attachments to Gabriel. It only interferes with the process he is following." "What process?" Julia couldn't stop the question from slipping out even though she knew she shouldn't ask. Mr. Peterson sighed, his expression hardening even more. "The boy is under strict medical care. Dr. Wallace has been managing his case for years and has a specific method. Any external interference could compromise the treatment. Mr. Miller pays us very well to follow his instructions. I suggest you remember that if you wish to keep this job." The threat was clear, and Julia lowered her eyes, murmuring an apology she didn't feel. She returned to her duties with the weight of the warning on her back, but she couldn't stop. Thinking about Gabriel, about that shy smile, about how he seemed less alone when she was around. What kind of medical treatment required a child to be isolated from any affection? What kind of father believed that love was an obstacle to a cure? That night, lying in her small room at the back of the mansion, Julia picked up her phone and called her mother in Millersburg. Mrs. Davis answered on the third ring, her voice weak but cheerful at the sound of her daughters. "How is it going over there, honey? Are you settling in okay?" Julia looked at the pristine white ceiling of her room, at the bare walls, at the window that faced a high wall. "It's different, Mom. Very different. The house is beautiful, but it's so empty at the same time. There's a boy here, the boss's son. He's deaf and he's always alone. It's just so sad, you know." "Oh, the poor thing," Mrs. Davis murmured. "But you have to be careful, Julia. Rich people have their ways, their rules. Don't go getting yourself into trouble, okay? You need this job." "I know, Mom, I know." Julia closed her eyes, feeling tears well up. "How are you doing? Were you able to get the medicine the doctor prescribed?" "I was, thank God, and the money you sent. I'm feeling better, Julia. You're doing the right thing. Just hang in there, honey. It's only until we can save up for the surgery." After she hung up, Julia lay awake for a long time, thinking about her mother who needed her, the job she couldn't lose, and Gabriel, the boy who had learned to expect nothing from anyone. She knew she should follow the rules, keep her distance and focus only on her work. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw that shy smile and felt that some rules were made to be questioned. The next day, Robert Miller finally crossed paths with Julia for the first time. It was late morning, and he was walking up the stairs, carrying a folder of documents, when he saw her coming out of the library. Robert stopped analyzing her with the same calculating gaze he used to evaluate employees at his companies. Julia felt exposed, as if he could read her thoughts, discover the small gestures of kindness she had been offering Gabriel. "You're new. Here," he said, not as a question but as a statement. "Yes, sir. Julia Williams at your service." She kept her voice steady, despite her nervousness. Robert nodded briefly. "Mr. Peterson told me about you. Said you're dedicated, punctual. Keep it that way and we won't have any problems." He started to continue up the stairs but stopped and turned back. "And stay away from my son. He doesn't need distractions." The words were spoken coldly, as if Gabriel were a business project that required total focus, not a child who needed attention. Julia swallowed the response she wanted to give and just nodded, watching Robert climb the remaining steps and disappear down the hall. She stood there for a moment, trying to understand how a father could be so blind to his own son's needs. But Julia Williams wasn't the type to give up easily. She had grown up in a humble family, where every dollar had to be stretched to the end of the month, where nothing was given and everything had to be earned through hard work. She had learned early on that the best things in life didn't cost money, love, affection, presents. These were riches no fortune could buy. And as she continued her tasks throughout the mansion, cleaning, organizing, keeping everything immaculate, a certainty grew within her. Gabriel deserved more than this suffocating silence. He deserved to be seen, to be heard in the only way that mattered, with the heart, not with the ears. The weeks passed and spring arrived in New York City, bringing longer days and flowers that bloomed in the mansion's gardens. Julia had established a careful routine, fulfilling all her duties perfectly, but finding small openings to exist in Gabriel's world without openly violating the rules. A flower left on the library windowsill, a piece of fruit cut into the shape of a star, a simple drawing on a sticky note left discreetly on the mirror of the bathroom he used. They were minimal, almost invisible gestures, but Gabriel noticed every one, and slowly, the boy who had learned to expect nothing began to look forward to the small, silent gifts Julia left in his path. One afternoon, while cleaning Gabriel's room during his session with a private tutor, Julia found an old shoebox under the bed. Curious, she opened it and discovered a treasure trove of memories, old photos of baby. Gabriel with a woman who must have been his mother, movie ticket stubs, seashells, and children's drawings yellowed with time. At the bottom of the box was a folded letter, written in a delicate feminine hand. Julia held the letter carefully, as if it were something sacred. The handwriting was delicate, feminine, filled with love in every curve of the words. It began with, "My dearest Gabriel," and went on to describe a mother's dreams and promises for her son. It spoke of the day he was born, of how she held that tiny baby in her arms and knew instantly she would love him more than life itself. It mentioned plans for the future, trips they would take together, stories she would tell, songs she would sing, even knowing he wouldn't hear them. The letter ended with a sentence that etched itself into Julia's mind. "Love doesn't need sound, my son. It makes itself felt in so many other ways. I will always be with you, even when I can't be." Julia's hands trembled as she placed the letter back in the box and returned it to its spot under the bed. She hadn't dared to ask about Gabriel's mother. No one in the mansion spoke of her, as if she were another forbidden topic on the endless list of unwritten rules. But that letter revealed something important. There was a time when love had lived in this house, when Gabriel had been enveloped in genuine affection. What had happened to turn it all into this mausoleum of silence? Julia finished cleaning the room with a heavy heart, thinking of the woman who had written such beautiful words, wondering where she was now if she knew how her son was living. When she went down to the first floor to get more cleaning supplies, she nearly collided with Dr. Henry Wallace in the hallway. The family doctor was a man in his 50s, impeccably dressed, with graying hair combed back and expensive-looking glasses. He carried a black leather briefcase and was talking to someone on his phone, his voice low but full of authority. "No, there can be no changes to the protocol," he was saying into the phone, walking past Julia as if she were invisible. "We've already discussed this. The treatment must proceed exactly as planned. Any change could compromise years of progress. He disappeared toward Robert's office, and Julia stood there processing his words. What kind of treatment was so rigid it couldn't be altered? And why did she get the feeling that this doctor spoke of Gabriel as if he were an experiment, not a patient? That evening, during the silent dinner the staff ate in the kitchen, Julia tried to find out more. She sat next to Maria, one of the longest-serving maids, a woman in her 40s who had worked there since before Gabriel was born. "Maria," Julia began casually, stirring the food on her plate. "Can I ask you a question?" Maria glanced around before answering, checking to see if Mr. Peterson was nearby. "Depends on the question." "Gabriel's mother. What happened to her?" Maria's face immediately shut down. "Julia, that's a topic we don't touch. Seriously. If Mr. Peterson hears you asking about that..." "I just want to understand," Julia insisted in a low voice. "How can a child live like this, so alone? It's not normal." Maria sighed, putting her fork down and looking directly at Julia. "Look, I'm only telling you this because you seem like a good person, and I don't want you getting into trouble for being curious. Mrs. Marina, Gabriel's mother, she had complications right after the boy was born. She spent a few months in the hospital, but she didn't make it. Mr. Miller never really recovered from the loss. When he found out Gabriel was born deaf, it was like something inside him broke. He became the man you see now, obsessed with finding a cure, as if that would erase everything that happened." Julia felt a tightness in her chest. "He thinks if Gabriel can hear, it will bring his wife back?" "I don't know what he thinks," Maria said, resuming her meal. "I just know that his way of dealing with things is only making the boy suffer more. But it's not our business, Julia. We work here, get paid at the end of the month, and go home. We can't change how rich people raise their kids." But Julia couldn't accept that resignation. That night, lying in her bed, she thought of Gabriel alone in that immense room, sleeping surrounded by expensive toys, but with no one to play with, surrounded by books, but with no one to share the stories with. She thought of the letter his mother had written, of the promises of love and presence that had been stolen by death. And she made a decision. Within the limits of what she could do, within the cracks of the rules, she would try to give Gabriel some of the affection he deserved. The following days brought a subtle but noticeable change in the dynamic between Julia and Gabriel. The boy began to seek her out more openly, not just staying in the same room, but quietly following her through the house as she worked. Julia would sense his silent presence behind her, but would say nothing, just continuing her tasks and allowing him to be near. Sometimes Gabriel would help, handing her things she needed, holding the laundry basket while she folded towels. They were simple, wordless interactions, but they were charged with meaning. One morning, Julia was changing the water in the flower vases in the hallway when Gabriel appeared, holding a small notebook and a pencil. He opened the notebook to a blank page and wrote in a childish but neat hand, "Do you like flowers?" Julia's heart sped up. It was the first time Gabriel had tried to communicate directly with her through written words. She quickly looked around, making sure no one was nearby before taking the pencil he offered. "I love them," she wrote. "In my town everyone has a garden with flowers." Gabriel read it, and his eyes lit up. He wrote back, "What's your town like?" And so began a silent conversation between them, through words scribbled in a notebook. Julia told him about Millersburg, about the quiet streets where everyone knew each other, about the river that ran through the town, about the Sunday barbecues at her grandmother's house where the whole family would gather. She told him about her mother, about how strong and brave she was despite her illness. Gabriel listened, or rather read everything with intense focus, asking questions, wanting to know more about this world so different from his own. "Do you have friends there?" he wrote at one point. Julia hesitated before answering. "I do. What about you? Do you have friends here?" Gabriel shook his head no, and Julia saw sadness flicker across his face. He wrote slowly, as if each word was heavy. "Daddy thinks friends will mess up my treatment." "What is this treatment?" Julia couldn't help but ask. Gabriel shrugged. Dr. Wallace says one day I'll be able to hear, but I don't know if I want to anymore. The revelation shocked Julia. She quickly took the pencil. Why not? Because then everyone will expect me to be normal. What if I can't be? The words, written in a child's hand, carried an immense weight. Julia wanted to hug the boy, to tell him he was already perfect just the way he was, that he didn't need to change to be loved. But she knew she couldn't. Not there. Not with the house rules and the risk of losing her job. So she did what she could. She wrote with all the sincerity she felt. You are already normal, Gabriel. Being deaf doesn't make you less than anyone. It just makes you different. And different is good. Gabriel looked at those words for a long time, running his finger over them as if he could absorb their meaning through his skin. Then, for the second time since Julia had met him, he smiled. But this time it was a bigger, more genuine smile, the kind a child should have every day. Julia treasured that image in her heart, knowing that, whatever happened, it had been worth the risk, just to see that smile. It was shortly after that day that Julia began to notice worrying changes in Gabriel. The boy, already naturally quiet, became even more withdrawn. He seemed tired all the time, with dark circles under his eyes. Julia noticed him frequently rubbing the side of his head, especially near his right ear, and sometimes he would wince in discomfort when he thought no one was looking. During his lessons with his private tutor, Gabriel struggled to concentrate, becoming restless and irritable in a way that was out of character for him. Julia tried to talk to Maria about her concerns, but the other maid just said that Gabriel always had bad days, that it was part of his condition. Mr. Miller and Dr. Wallace know what they're doing, Julia. Don't get involved. But Julia couldn't ignore what she was seeing. One afternoon, while tidying the library, she watched Gabriel trying to read one of his favorite books. The boy kept flipping the pages quickly, without really looking at them, holding his head with one hand. Julia approached slowly and gently touched his shoulder. Gabriel turned with a start, and she saw tears in the corners of his eyes. Without thinking of the consequences, Julia knelt in front of him and took out the notebook she now carried everywhere. "What hurts?" she wrote. Gabriel hesitated, his face a mixture of wanting to tell and fear of confessing. Finally, he took the pencil with trembling hands. "My head hurts a lot, for days." "Did you tell your dad?" "He'll call Dr. Wallace, and I don't want to see Dr. Wallace." The way Gabriel wrote that name, with rushed, tense letters, revealed a deep fear. A chill ran down Julia's spine. "Why not?" Gabriel didn't answer, just looked away and closed the notebook. Julia didn't press, but his reaction stuck in her mind. What kind of doctor inspired fear instead of comfort in a patient? She knew she had to do something, but she didn't know what. If she told Robert, she would probably be fired for interacting with Gabriel against orders. If she stayed quiet, the boy would continue to suffer. That night, Julia couldn't sleep. She lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about Gabriel, the words he had written, the fear in his eyes. She remembered her younger brother, David, who had died at 7 from an infection that started as a simple earache. Her parents had delayed getting proper help, thinking it would go away on its own, and by the time they finally took him to the hospital, it was too late. The pain of losing her brother was still raw for Julia, even after 15 years. She wouldn't stand by if there was a chance Gabriel was going through something similar. The next morning, Julia made a decision. During her lunch break, when most of the staff were in the kitchen, she slipped out of the mansion and went to a nearby pharmacy. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but she spoke to the pharmacist, describing Gabriel's symptoms without mentioning his name or the fact that he was deaf. The man, an elderly gentleman with thick glasses, listened intently. "Could be a lot of things," he said, scratching his chin. "Persistent headache, discomfort around the ear, irritability. Could be anything from a simple migraine to something more serious, like an improperly treated infection. Is the child seeing a doctor?" "He is," Julia replied, "but I wanted a second opinion." The pharmacist nodded understandingly. "Look, without an examination, I can't say much. But if the pain is persistent and getting worse, it shouldn't be ignored, especially in children. Their bodies let you know when something is wrong." Julia thanked him and returned to the mansion with an even heavier heart. She knew she needed to talk to someone, but who? Robert would probably fire her on the spot for meddling. Mr. Peterson blindly followed his boss's orders. Maria and the other staff preferred not to get involved. There was only one option left, as risky as it was. That afternoon, when she learned that Dr. Wallace was coming for one of Gabriel's routine appointments, Julia planned to be nearby. She stayed cleaning the hallway near the room where the appointments took place, moving slowly, listening for sounds from inside. She could hear Dr. Wallace's deep voice but couldn't make out the words. After about 40 minutes, the door opened and the doctor came out, accompanied by Robert. "The tests are all normal," Dr. Wallace was saying, arranging papers in his briefcase. "As always, no significant changes. Continue with the medication I prescribed. And the possibility of the cochlear implant we discussed?" Robert asked, his voice filled with anxious hope. "It's still not the right time," the doctor replied firmly. "We need to follow the protocol. Any premature intervention could compromise the entire process. Trust me, Robert. We've been working together for years. I know what's best for Gabriel." The two said their goodbyes and Dr. Wallace headed down the stairs toward the exit. Julia, acting on impulse, followed him quickly. She caught up to him in the foyer, calling out in a low but urgent voice. "Dr. Wallace, excuse me." The doctor stopped and turned, surprised. He looked at Julia with an expression that mixed curiosity and irritation. "Yes? Do you need something?" Julia took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "It's about Gabriel, sir. I work here, and I've noticed he isn't well. He's complaining of severe headaches, constantly rubbing his right ear, and he's tired and irritable. I know it's not my place to say anything, but I'm worried." Dr. Wallace's face hardened. "You work here as what, exactly?" "I'm a housekeeper, sir. I do the cleaning and organizing." "I see." The doctor crossed his arms. "And since when do housekeepers have the medical training to make diagnoses?" The condescension in his voice made Julia's blood boil, but she maintained her composure. "I don't have medical training, sir, but I have eyes, and I see that that boy is suffering." "Gabriel has been under my care for years," Dr. Wallace said, his voice low but threatening. "I know every aspect of his condition. What you call suffering is a natural part of the treatment. I suggest you return to your duties and leave medical matters to those who understand them." He turned to leave, but Julia couldn't stay silent. What if it's something serious? What if he needs help now? Dr. Wallace stopped with his hand on the doorknob. For a moment, Julia thought he would respond with anger, but when he turned back, his face was calm, almost friendly, in a way that was even more unsettling. "Listen carefully, miss," Dr. Wallace said in a controlled voice. "Gabriel has a complex condition that requires years of specialized monitoring. Any unnecessary alarmism only hinders the treatment's progress and causes undue stress to the family. If you truly care about the boy's well-being, stick to your job and let the professionals do theirs. Is that clear?" Julia nodded mechanically, but as she watched the doctor walk out the front door and get into his imported car, a certainty grew inside her. Something was deeply wrong here. The way he had dismissed her concerns without even considering investigating, the way he spoke of Gabriel as if he were a clinical case and not a suffering child. Something didn't add up. That night, Julia couldn't get the matter out of her head. After all the staff had gone to bed and the mansion was plunged into its nightly silence, she lay awake in her room thinking. She remembered her brother David, how the adults had ignored the signs until it was too late. She remembered the letter from Gabriel's mother, the promises to protect him, and she made a decision that would change everything. In the early hours of the morning, Julia slipped out of her room and went up to the second floor. She knew it was a serious breach of the rules, that if she were caught she could be fired or worse, but something bigger than fear was driving her. She needed to see Gabriel, to make sure he was okay. She walked through the hallways, lit only by the moonlight streaming through the tall windows, her bare feet making no sound on the cold floor. Gabriel's bedroom door was ajar, as it always was by Robert's order, so they could check on the boy during the night without waking him. Julia pushed it open gently and went inside, her heart pounding. Gabriel was asleep in his immense bed, looking too small for the giant piece of furniture, covered by Egyptian cotton sheets. The moonlight cast silvery patterns on his face, and Julia could clearly see the deep circles under his eyes, his brow furrowed even in sleep, as if he found no rest even in his dreams. Julia approached slowly, watching the boy's irregular breathing. It was then that she noticed something that made her freeze. Gabriel was moving his head from side to side, restless, and his right hand repeatedly went up to his ear, rubbing it even as he slept. The gesture was compulsive, automatic, as if his body were trying to relieve something his conscious mind couldn't process. Julia knelt beside the bed, getting closer, and that's when she saw it. In Gabriel's right ear canal, partially visible from the position he was sleeping in, there was something. At first Julia thought it was just a shadow, an effect of the dim light, but the more she looked, the more certain she became. There was a dark mass in there, something that shouldn't be. It wasn't big enough to be visible from a distance, but up close, with the moonlight hitting it at that specific angle, it was impossible to miss. Julia's heart raced. This explained everything. The pain, the irritability, the constant discomfort. Gabriel had something in his ear, an infection, a blockage, something that was causing him suffering and that Dr. Wallace had either not seen or chosen to ignore. Julia left the room as silently as she had entered, but her mind was racing. She had to do something, but what? If she told Robert, he would call Dr. Wallace, and the doctor would simply dismiss her observations again, maybe even accuse her of making things up. If she stayed quiet, Gabriel would continue to suffer, and whatever was in his ear could get worse. She thought about calling her mother for advice, but Mrs. Davis, as wise as she was, would have no answer for such a complex situation. Back in her room, Julia picked up her phone and started searching. She spent hours reading about ear infections, auditory canal blockages, and complications in deaf children. The more she read, the more her concern grew. Untreated infections could lead to serious complications, including spreading to other areas. Blockages could cause permanent damage if not removed properly. And worst of all, in deaf children, these problems were often overlooked because traditional symptoms like hearing loss or ringing in the ears didn't apply. As the sun began to rise, painting the New York sky in shades of orange and pink, Julia made a decision. She couldn't wait for permission. She couldn't trust the system that was clearly failing Gabriel. She would have to act alone, despite knowing the risks. She remembered her grandmother, Grandma Betty, who had been a midwife and healer in the village where she was born, known for treating all sorts of problems with home remedies and traditional techniques. Julia had grown up watching her grandmother clean wounds, treat simple infections, and remove splinters and thorns with steady hands, a knowledge passed down through generations. During the day, Julia went about her duties as usual, but her mind was working on a plan. She would need basic supplies: a small sterilized pair of tweezers, warm oil to soften any blockage, adequate light to see better, and most importantly, absolute privacy. She knew what she planned to do was risky, that it could go wrong in 1,000 different ways, but the alternative was to let Gabriel continue suffering while a negligent doctor pretended everything was fine. In the afternoon, while Gabriel was in his sign language class with his private tutor, Julia slipped out of the mansion once more. She went to a different pharmacy in a more distant neighborhood where no one would know her. She bought rubbing alcohol, cotton balls, a small pair of metal tweezers, and asked the pharmacist about ear cleaning techniques. The man, thinking she was asking for herself, gave her basic instructions on safety and what to avoid. Julia absorbed every word, memorizing every detail. She returned to the mansion with the supplies hidden in her bag, her heart heavy with the magnitude of what she was about to do. She spent the rest of the day observing Gabriel whenever she could. The boy was visibly worse, barely touching his food at dinner, his hands trembling slightly. Julia saw Robert look at his son with concern for a few seconds before turning his attention back to the documents he was reading at the table. The man saw, but he didn't truly see. He looked, but he didn't perceive. It was as if an invisible wall separated him from his son, a wall built of fear, guilt, and the illusion of control. That night, Julia waited until she was sure everyone was asleep. She checked the security patrol schedules, memorized the patterns of movement in the house. Around 2 in the morning, when the mansion was at its most silent, she gathered her supplies and went up to Gabriel's room again. The boy was sleeping fitfully, his face contorted in an expression of discomfort, even while unconscious. Julia placed everything she had brought on the nightstand, sterilizing the tweezers with alcohol, preparing cotton balls and positioning the lamp for strategic lighting. She approached the bed and gently touched Gabriel's shoulder. The boy woke with a start, his eyes wide in the darkness. When he saw it was Julia, he relaxed a little, but confusion was evident on his face. Julia took out the notebook she always carried now and wrote quickly, her hands shaking slightly. "I know you're in pain. I saw something in your ear. I can try to help, but you have to trust me and stay very still. Do you trust me?" Gabriel read the words in the dim light of the lamp. For a long moment he just looked at Julia, his dark, deep eyes seeming to see right through her, evaluating, deciding. Then, slowly, he nodded. The trust in that simple gesture nearly broke Julia's heart. This boy, who had every reason not to trust anyone, was putting his faith in her. Julia positioned Gabriel so the lamplight illuminated his right ear. With hands she tried to keep steady despite her nerves. She looked into the ear canal. Now, with direct and proper light, she could see clearly. There was a dark mass there, looking like it was composed of dried wax mixed with something else, perhaps remnants of an old, never fully treated infection. It wasn't just a simple blockage. It was an accumulation that must have been there for a long time, compressed and hardened, causing constant pressure and pain. "This might be a little uncomfortable," Julia wrote, "but I'll be very careful. If it hurts too much, let me know, okay?" Gabriel nodded again, squeezing his eyes shut, bracing himself. Julia applied a few drops of warm oil into his ear, hoping to soften the blockage. Then, with the sterilized tweezers and extremely careful movements, she began to work. It was a slow, delicate process, removing tiny pieces at a time, cleaning the tweezers between each movement. Gabriel tensed his body now and then, but remained admirably still, trusting her completely. Julia worked for nearly 20 minutes, breaking out in a cold sweat, each movement calculated with millimeter precision. With each piece she removed, she placed it on a tissue beside them, forming a small pile of darkened material. She was almost finished, able to see the back of the ear canal finally clear, when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Her heart stopped. The footsteps were getting closer, firm and determined. It was too late to hide everything, to pretend she was doing something else. The door burst open, and the light from the hallway flooded the room. Mr. Peterson stood there, his expression shifting from surprise to horror in a matter of seconds. Behind him, drawn by the noise, appeared Robert Miller wearing a robe, his hair disheveled, his eyes still sleepy but quickly becoming alert as he took in the scene before him. "What is going on in here?" Robert's voice boomed like thunder in the quiet night. Julia stood up automatically, the tweezers still in her hand, and that's when it happened. Robert saw his son lying on the bed, his ear red from the procedure, the tissue with that dark mass on it, and Julia standing there with an instrument in her hand. The conclusion he drew was the worst possible one. "What did you do to my son?" Robert strode into the room, his voice rising. "Peterson, call the police. This woman was hurting Gabriel." "No!" Julia cried, trying to explain, but the words tumbled out in a jumble. "I wasn't hurting him, I was helping. He had something blocking his ear, it was causing him pain." But Robert wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on Gabriel, who was now sitting up in bed, confused and frightened by the chaos. Mr. Peterson was already pulling out his phone to make the call when Gabriel did something no one expected. He got out of bed, stumbling a little, and went to the nightstand. He grabbed the notebook and pencil and began to write frantically. Then he showed the paper to his father, his hands shaking. "She was helping me. I asked her. My ear hurt so much. Please, don't hurt her." Robert read the words, but the anger still burned in his eyes. "You don't know what you're saying, Gabriel. This woman has no medical training. She could have caused irreversible damage." "I've already called the police," Mr. Peterson announced, putting his phone away. "And Dr. Wallace, too, he's on his way." Julia felt her legs give way. Everything had gone wrong. She had tried to help, and now she was going to be treated like a criminal. She looked at Gabriel, saw the tears streaming down his face, and wished more than anything that she could tell him everything would be okay, but she didn't know if it would be. The next few minutes were a blur of motion and confusion. Robert ordered Mr. Peterson to take Julia to the security room on the ground floor, a small windowless room where the property's guards stayed during the day. Julia was practically dragged down the stairs, hearing Gabriel screaming, not with words but with anguished sounds, trying to stop them from taking her. The sound was terrible, primal, the voice of someone who rarely used their vocal cords being pushed to an extreme of desperation. In the security room, Julia sat on a hard chair, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She could hear movement in the house, raised voices, and then the sound of an approaching siren. She closed her eyes, thinking of her mother, of how Mrs. Davis would receive the news that her daughter had been arrested. She thought of Gabriel, the boy, who had finally trusted someone, only to see that person violently torn away from him. She thought of everything that had gone wrong, when all she had wanted was to make something right. Dr. Wallace arrived before the police. Julia heard his voice in the foyer, speaking with Robert, his tone urgent but controlled. She couldn't make out the words, but she could imagine the content. Warnings about contamination, risks of infection, a possible lawsuit for practicing medicine without a license. Every accusation probably true, every consequence probably deserved. She had acted without permission, without proper knowledge, driven only by urgency and the belief that she was doing the right thing, and maybe it had been the most wrong thing she could have done. How much time passed? Julia couldn't say. It could have been minutes or hours. Time had lost all meaning in that windowless room. When the door finally opened, it was Dr. Wallace carrying his briefcase, followed by Robert, who wore an expression Julia couldn't decipher. The doctor looked at her with barely concealed contempt. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he began, his voice cold and authoritative. "Gabriel is in a state of shock. The ear canal is traumatized. Any progress we've made in recent years may have been compromised by your irresponsible interference." Julia wanted to defend herself, to explain what she had seen, but the words died in her throat. Who would believe her over a renowned doctor? Who would value the word of a housekeeper from a small town over an expert with decades of experience? She lowered her eyes, defeated. "The police are on their way up to take your statement," Dr. Wallace continued. "I advise you to cooperate fully. It may influence the charges that will be brought against you." Robert, who had been silent until then, finally spoke. "Henry, are you sure that's what caused his state? Couldn't it be the earache she mentioned?" "Robert, please," the doctor sighed as if dealing with a stubborn child. "Gabriel did not have an earache. I examined him less than a week ago. He was perfectly fine. What he's feeling now is the result of the trauma caused by this." He gestured at Julia with disdain. "This grotesque invasion." It was at that moment that a sound echoed through the mansion, coming from the floor above. A sound that made Robert Miller freeze completely, that made Dr. Wallace turn sharply, that made Julia lift her eyes, her heart pounding. It was a voice, Gabriel's voice. Not an inarticulate cry, not a sound of desperation, but a word. Clear, recognizable, impossible. "Daddy!" The word floated through the air like something tangible, carrying a weight that transcended sound itself. Robert bolted from the room, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Dr. Wallace followed, leaving Julia alone once more. She could hear the commotion upstairs, hurried footsteps, raised voices, and then silence. A silence so profound, it seemed to suck all the air out of the house. Julia didn't know how long she sat there, processing what she had just heard. Gabriel had spoken. For the first time in his life, the boy who was born deaf had produced an understandable word. It was impossible, it was miraculous, it was terrifying in its improbability. And Julia, with her desperate, unauthorized intervention, had something to do with it. When the police officers finally arrived, they found a house in emotional chaos. They went up to the 2nd floor, where Robert was kneeling beside Gabriel's bed, holding his son's hands as tears streamed down his face. The boy was pale, exhausted, but his eyes were open and aware. Dr. Wallace stood nearby, checking Gabriel's vital signs with an expression that wavered between professional concern and something harder to define. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, came down to the security room where Julia was waiting. He asked the standard questions, jotted down her answers in a notepad, and documented the scene. Julia answered everything in a monotone voice, too tired to feel fear. She told him about Gabriel's pain, about what she had seen in his ear, about her decision to act when no one else seemed willing to. The officer listened without judgment, simply recording the facts. "Ma'am, do you understand that what you did was extremely dangerous?" he asked at the end. "That you could have caused serious harm to the child?" "I understand," Julia answered softly, "but I couldn't just stand by and watch him suffer." The officer closed his notepad and looked at her with an expression that was almost understanding. "I'm going to have to take you down to the station for a formal statement. The rest will depend on whether the child's guardians decide to press charges." Julia nodded, resigned. She let herself be led to the police car parked in front of the mansion. As she passed through the foyer, she took one last look at the house that, for a few weeks, had been her workplace, and where she had found a boy who desperately needed someone to care. She didn't know if she would ever see it again, if she would ever see Gabriel again. The pain of that uncertainty was almost physical. At the police station, the questions were repeated, the bureaucratic process of recording her version of events. Julia was photographed, fingerprinted, and signed papers she barely read. It all felt surreal, as if it were happening to someone else. When they finally let her make a phone call, her hands were shaking so much she could barely dial her mother's number. "Mom?" Her voice broke as soon as Mrs. Davis answered. "Julia, honey, what time is it? What happened?" Between sobs, Julia told her everything. She held nothing back, from the first day she saw Gabriel to the moment she was arrested. Mrs. Davis listened in silence, and when Julia finished, there were tears in the older woman's voice too. "My child," Mrs. Davis said, her voice thick with emotion, "you did what your heart told you to do. I can't say it was sensible, I can't say it was right, but I know it was done with love, and love is never completely wrong." Her mother's words were a balm, but they didn't erase the reality of the situation. Julia would spend the night at the station, awaiting decisions that were out of her hands. She lay down on the hard cot in the cell, staring at the stained ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened, and thinking most of all about that one word she had heard Gabriel speak. Daddy, his first word, torn from 10 years of silence, echoing in a house that had always been far too quiet. Meanwhile, at the Miller mansion, Robert couldn't leave Gabriel's side. He sat by his son's bed all night, watching him sleep fitfully. Dr. Wallace had examined the boy extensively, declaring that there was no permanent damage, but that careful monitoring was necessary. Then he had left, but not before re-emphasizing the risks of what had happened, the danger of non-professional interventions. But Robert couldn't stop thinking about that word. Gabriel had spoken. His son, whom he had dragged to dozens of specialists who had undergone countless tests and treatments, had spoken for the first time not in a sophisticated clinic or during an expensive medical procedure, but in a moment of desperation calling for him. And it had been after a housekeeper had done something Dr. Wallace had dismissed as impossible, removing a blockage that was causing pain. The next morning, Robert got up early, his eyes red from exhaustion, but his mind strangely clear. Gabriel was still asleep, so he went down to his office. Anne started making calls, first to his lawyer, then to a few contacts at the hospital where Dr. Wallace had a practice. He requested complete copies of Gabriel's medical history, all the tests from the past few years, all the prescriptions, all the reports. He wanted to understand. He needed to understand what was going on. It was Maria who brought his breakfast to the office. The long-serving maid had swollen eyes. She had clearly been crying. She placed the tray on his desk with excessive care. "Mr. Miller," she began hesitantly, "may I say something?" Robert looked up at her, surprised. In all the years Maria had worked there, she had never initiated a conversation beyond what was strictly necessary. "Of course." Maria took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Julia, she wasn't trying to hurt Gabriel. She genuinely cared about him. She saw him every day, saw that he was suffering. She just wanted to help." She has no medical training, Robert countered, but without the anger of the previous night. She could have caused irreversible damage. With all due respect, sir. Maria kept her eyes down but continued speaking. That boy is living in a prison. He has everything money can buy, but he has nothing he really needs. Julia was the first person in a long time who looked at him and saw a child, not a problem to be solved. The words hit Robert like a slap. He wanted to deny it, to say Maria didn't know what she was talking about, but the truth in them was undeniable. Gabriel had everything, except what mattered most. He had a huge house, but no home. He had a father, but no real presence. He had top-tier medical treatment, but no cure for his loneliness. Gabriel spoke yesterday, Robert said quietly, more to himself than to Maria. For the first time in 10 years, my son spoke. I know, sir. Everyone in the house heard. It was a miracle. It was a miracle, Robert repeated, but not the kind I was expecting, and maybe it was exactly the miracle he needed. After Maria left, Robert sat for a long time in his leather armchair, looking at the photos in his office. There was one of Marina, his late wife, smiling with baby Gabriel in her arms. Another of Gabriel at 2 before they knew about his deafness. Another still of Gabriel at 5, already in treatment with Dr. Wallace, with a serious, tired expression that no 5-year-old should have. Robert realized there wasn't a single recent photo of Gabriel smiling. When was the last time he had seen his son genuinely happy? The hours passed and the documents began to arrive. Medical history, test results, detailed reports. Robert dove into them with the same intensity he used to analyze business contracts. And the more he read, the more questions arose. There were gaps in the treatments, procedures that seemed overly repetitive, medications that didn't make complete sense. And above all, there was one thing that bothered him deeply. At no point in Dr. Wallace's recent reports was there any mention of any kind of blockage or infection in Gabriel's ear. How could a doctor who examined the boy regularly have missed something a housekeeper was able to see? Robert picked up the phone and called a contact he had at Mount Sinai Hospital, a college friend who had become a renowned otolaryngologist. He explained the situation, the symptoms Gabriel had been showing, what Julia had found. The doctor on the other end of the line was silent for a moment before responding. Robert, what you're describing sounds like a case of impacted earwax, possibly with remnants of a chronic infection. In cases like that, it's common for the person to feel severe pain, pressure, irritability. Removal usually relieves the symptoms immediately. But tell me something, wasn't your son getting regular checkups? How did no one notice this before? The question echoed in Robert's mind. How did no one notice? Or did someone notice and choose to do nothing? The second option was unthinkable, too grotesque to consider, but the more he thought, the more he reviewed the documents before him, the more that impossible possibility began to take shape. Robert thanked his friend and hung up, his mind working furiously. He needed answers, real answers, not the convenient explanations Dr. Wallace always provided. He decided it was time to get a second medical opinion, a third, as many as it took. But first, he needed to talk to Gabriel. His son, who had finally spoken after a decade of silence, deserved to be truly heard. He went up to Gabriel's room and found the boy awake, sitting in bed with a book open on his lap, but not really reading it. When he saw his father enter, Gabriel tensed as if expecting more trouble, more recriminations. Robert felt a pang of pain as he realized his son was afraid of him, not a fear of physical violence, but the more subtle fear of disappointing, of failing to meet impossible expectations. Robert sat on the edge of the bed, keeping enough distance not to invade Gabriel's space, but close enough for them to look each other in the eye. He picked up the notebook from the nightstand, the same one Gabriel used to communicate with Julia, and wrote, in a careful hand, "How are you feeling today?" Gabriel read it and hesitated before picking up the pencil. He wrote slowly, "The headache is gone. My ear still feels a little weird, but better." Robert nodded and wrote back, "Gabriel, I need you to be completely honest with me. How long were you in pain?" The boy bit his lip, clearly debating whether to tell the truth. Finally, he wrote, "A couple of weeks, maybe more. It started slow and got worse." Why didn't you tell me? Gabriel's answer came with painful frankness. Because whenever I complain about something, you call Dr. Wallace, and I didn't want to see Dr. Wallace. Those words were like a punch to Robert's gut. Why not? Gabriel wrote for a long time, erasing and rewriting, searching for the right words. When he finally showed the notebook to his father, Robert felt the world tremble beneath his feet. He scares me. He always asks so many questions, always examines me too much, always says he's close to curing me, but nothing ever happens. Sometimes I feel like he likes that I'm deaf, so he can keep studying me. I know it sounds crazy, but that's how I feel. Robert read those words 3 times, feeling each one cut deeper. His son, a 10-year-old child, was saying he didn't trust the doctor Robert had personally chosen, whom he paid a fortune to treat him. And worse, he was saying he felt like a research subject, not a patient. How does a father let things get to this point? Gabriel, Robert wrote with trembling hands, you spoke yesterday. You called me Daddy. It was the first time I heard your voice say a real word. Do you remember that? Gabriel nodded, his eyes filling with tears. He wrote, I just wanted them to stop taking Julia away. She's the first person who was really nice to me, who didn't treat me like I was pathetic or like a patient, just like, I don't know, a normal person. The tears Robert had been holding back finally fell. He had tried so hard to give his son the best treatment, the best chances, but he had forgotten to give him the most basic thing, humanity, connection, the chance to just be a kid, and a housekeeper from a small town, with no medical training but a huge heart, had achieved in weeks what he hadn't managed in 10 years, making Gabriel feel seen, valued, and loved. Julia is at the police station, Robert wrote, because of what happened last night. The authorities want to know if I'm going to press charges against her. Gabriel's eyes widened, panic visible on his face. He grabbed the pencil and wrote with such force he nearly tore the paper. No, Daddy, please. She was only helping. She saved me. Don't let them take her. The desperation in the words, written in capital letters and thick strokes, broke Robert's heart. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a simple gesture he hadn't made in a long time, and wrote, I won't do anything that will hurt you more, Gabriel. I promise. Robert left the room with a clarity of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He picked up the phone and called the police station where Julia was being held. He spoke to the officer in charge, said he would not be pressing charges, that it had all been a misunderstanding, that the young woman had acted with the best intentions. The officer, skeptical but with no legal choice, said he would release Julia as soon as they completed the paperwork. The next call was harder. Robert dialed the number for Dr. Wallace's office and waited. When the secretary answered, he asked to speak directly to the doctor. Henry answered with his professional, solicitous voice. Robert, how is Gabriel today? Did he get some rest? Henry, I need to talk to you. In person. Today. Of course, of course. Would you like me to stop by the mansion later? No, Robert said firmly. I want you to bring all of Gabriel's files, all the tests, all the reports, everything. And we're going. To talk in my office here, not as friends, but as doctor and client. I have questions that need clear answers. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Robert, has something happened that I should know about? A lot has happened, Henry. A lot. Robert hung up without waiting for a reply. While he waited for the doctor to arrive, Robert made one more call. To Mount Sinai Hospital, scheduling an urgent consultation for Gabriel with a full team of specialists who had no connection to Dr. Wallace. He wanted an impartial, complete evaluation, without the filters and interpretations of someone who might have conflicts of interest that Robert was only now beginning to suspect. At that moment, at the police station, Julia was being told she was being released. The officer explained that the child's guardian had decided not to press charges, that she was free to go. Julia walked out of the cell in a daze, hardly believing what she was hearing. She collected her belongings, signed the necessary papers, and stepped out into the daylight, which blinded her for a moment. She had no money for a bus ticket back to Millersburg, no job anymore, no idea what to do now. She sat on the steps of the police station, the New York sun on her face, and allowed herself to cry. She cried with relief, with exhaustion, with sadness for everything that had happened and for having to leave Gabriel behind. That's how Maria found her an hour later. The older maid had arrived in a taxi, sent by Robert with a specific message to bring Julia back to the mansion. Julia looked at Maria, confused, but the other woman just smiled gently and said, "Come on, dear, there's someone who needs... see you." The ride back to the mansion was silent, Julia staring out the taxi window without really seeing the city pass by. When they arrived, Maria led her not to the back of the house where the staff quarters were, but to the main entrance. There at the door stood Robert Miller, and beside him Gabriel. The boy, upon seeing Julia, let go of his father's hand and ran to her. Julia knelt instinctively, and Gabriel threw himself into her arms, hugging her tightly, desperately, as if he feared she would disappear if he let go. Julia hugged him back, her tears soaking his hair, feeling his small body tremble against hers. When they finally separated, Gabriel took the notebook he was carrying and wrote something, showing it to Julia with still moist eyes. "Thank you for saving me." Julia looked at those words, at the boy who had written them, and at the father who was watching the scene with a deeply emotional expression. She didn't know what would happen now, whether she still had a job or if she would be sent away regardless. But in that moment, feeling Gabriel holding her hand, seeing something in Robert's face that looked like a mixture of remorse and determination, Julia allowed herself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, something good could come out of all this madness. Maybe the silence that had dominated this house for so long was finally about to be truly broken. Dr. Henry Wallace arrived at the mansion 2 hours later, carrying a bulky folder with the requested documents. His expression was carefully neutral, but Robert, who had spent decades reading people in boardrooms, could sense the tension beneath the professional facade. He led the doctor to his office and closed the door behind them. For a moment, they just stood there, two men who had known each other for a decade, now separated by questions that could no longer be avoided. "Robert," Henry began, placing the folder on the desk, "before we start, I need you to understand that everything I did was with Gabriel's best interests at heart. Every decision, every treatment was based on years of medical experience and knowledge." "Then explain something to me," Robert said, sitting behind his desk and adopting the posture he used in tough negotiations. "How does a doctor with years of experience fail to notice a blockage in the ear of a patient he examines regularly, a blockage so significant it was causing intense pain?" Henry hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "Robert, I examined Gabriel thoroughly last week. There were no signs of a blockage or infection." "There were no signs, or you didn't want to see them." The question came out harsher than Robert intended, but he didn't soften it. "Because I have here," he tapped the documents spread across his desk, "reports from the last 5 years, and you know what I've noticed, a pattern. Every time it seems we're close to a real solution, something that could actually help Gabriel. You find a reason to postpone, to wait longer, to run more tests." "That's standard medical protocol," Henry defended himself, but his voice had lost some of its usual authority. "We can't rush into interventions that could cause more harm than good. Interventions like a cochlear implant that we discussed 3 years ago and that you always find reasons not to perform, or alternative therapies that other specialists suggested, but you dismissed without even considering." Robert stood up, his frustration finally boiling over. "Henry, I trusted you. Completely. I put my son in your hands because you promised you would do everything possible, but now I'm starting to wonder, were you really trying to help Gabriel, or were you using him for something else?" The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken accusations. Henry turned pale, his hands gripping the arms of the chair where he sat. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, stripped of the performative confidence he always carried. "You don't understand the complexity of Gabriel's case. His congenital deafness isn't simple. There are nuances, specificities that require a careful approach." "Then, explain these nuances to me," Robert said, picking up one of the reports. "Because this says you were monitoring the development of a rare condition related to neurological adaptation in cases of prolonged deafness. It doesn't talk about curing Gabriel, it talks about studying him." Henry closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, there was something different in them. Not the arrogance of a renowned specialist, but the weariness of someone who has carried a weight for a long time. "Robert, When I started treating Gabriel 10 years ago, my intentions were genuine. I wanted to help. But over time, I realized his case was extraordinary from a scientific standpoint. The way his brain adapted to the absence of auditory stimuli, the development of alternative neural pathways, it was fascinating. Fascinating, Robert repeated the word as if it were poison. My son is fascinating to you. An interesting case study. It wasn't just that, Henry said, getting up and walking to the window. I was developing research on neural plasticity in deaf children. Gabriel's data was crucial, but I never ever intentionally harmed him. The treatments I prescribed were legitimate. But they weren't the best ones. Were they? Robert's voice was cold now, controlled. They were the treatments that kept Gabriel in the ideal state for your research. That's why you never wanted to do the cochlear implant. That's why you dismissed other alternatives. Because any significant change would compromise your data. Henry turned abruptly. That's not true. I always put Gabriel's well-being first. And the blockage in his ear, the one causing him terrible pain. Did you know about that, Henry? The question came out like a final accusation. The doctor was silent for a long moment. When he finally answered, his voice was resigned. I knew there was an accumulation. I saw it in the last few checkups, but Robert, technically it wasn't urgent. It could have been treated properly in a hospital setting with the correct procedures. But you didn't treat it. You let my son suffer because in your mind it was technically not urgent. Robert felt a rage he hadn't felt in years, the kind that made his hands shake. Do you know what a housekeeper with no medical training did? She saw my son suffering and she acted. She didn't calculate research risks. She didn't think about academic papers. She just saw a child in pain and tried to help. And you know what? She accomplished what you couldn't in 10 years. She made Gabriel feel important, cared for, human. Robert, I understand your anger, but we can't ignore the risks of what she did. Improper removal could have caused damage to the eardrum, secondary infections, perforations. But it didn't, Robert interrupted. And you know why? Because she cared enough to be careful. You, on the other hand, with all your training and equipment, chose to do nothing. Henry sat down again, defeated. What are you going to do now? I'll tell you what I'm going to do, Robert said, remaining standing, imposing. First, you're going to give me full access to all the data from your research involving Gabriel. Everything, every note, every analysis. Second, I'm taking this information to the State Medical Board and letting them decide if your conduct was appropriate. Third, Gabriel will no longer be your patient. I've already scheduled appointments with a team at Mount Sinai who will evaluate him without any conflicts of interest. Robert, this will destroy my career. Henry's voice was almost pleading. And you think I care? Robert leaned over the desk, his eyes meeting the doctor's with fierce intensity. You used my son, Henry. You turned the trust I placed in you into a research opportunity. You turned a child's suffering into data for a study. If your career survives this, it will be more than you deserve. Henry fell silent, knowing there was no argument that could save the situation. He stood up slowly, picked up his briefcase, and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the knob and turned one last time. For what it's worth, Robert, I'm sorry. I truly believed in the beginning that I was doing the right thing. I don't know at what point it became about the research and not about Gabriel. But you're right. I failed him. I failed him badly. Yes, you did, Robert agreed without mercy. Now get out of my house and never come back. After Henry left, Robert sat in his office for a long time, processing everything that had happened. He had dedicated 10 years to following the advice of a man who had betrayed his trust in the most vile way possible. How many opportunities had he wasted? How many moments with Gabriel had he sacrificed for a treatment that was never really intended to cure? A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Julia, standing in the doorway with a hesitant expression. Robert gestured for her to come in. Mr. Miller, I don't want to bother you. I just wanted to know what's going to happen now. I know I don't have a job here anymore. I just wanted to say goodbye to Gabriel before I leave. Robert looked at the young woman who had turned his house upside down in just a few weeks. She came from a simple background with no college degree, no resources, but she had something all his money couldn't buy, a heart that saw beyond appearances. "Julia, please sit down," he said, indicating the chair Henry had occupied minutes before. When she sat, clearly nervous, Robert continued, "I need to apologize to you. I accused you of hurting my son when in fact you were the only person who was able to truly see him, to see past the deafness, past the treatments, past everything I forced him to be. Mr. Miller, I just did what I thought was right. And that's exactly what I should have done a long time ago," Robert interrupted gently. "Julia, I just found out that the doctor I trusted was using Gabriel for research purposes, that he knew about the blockage in his ear but chose not to treat it because it didn't fit his plans. You, with no obligation, risked your job, your freedom, to help a child you barely knew. That's not just courage, it's humanity in its purest form." Tears began to stream down Julia's face. "I saw him every day, saw how lonely he was, how no one really paid attention to him. It reminded me of my brother David, whom I lost because we waited too long to get help. I couldn't let it happen again." "And it didn't," Robert said firmly. "Because of you, Gabriel is better now than he has been in years." He spoke for the first time. And it wasn't just the word itself, it was the context. He spoke because he cared about you, because he didn't want you to be taken away. That's more important than any medical progress. "What's going to happen to Gabriel now?" "I'm taking him for a full evaluation at Mount Sinai. New doctors, new perspectives, without the hidden agendas Dr. Wallace had. And regardless of what we find out, regardless of whether he'll ever hear or not, I'm going to learn to be the father he needs. The father who sees him as a person, not a problem to be solved." Julia smiled through her tears. "He'll love to hear that. Gabriel is a wonderful boy, Mr. Miller. He just needed someone to see it." "And you saw it," Robert said, pausing to choose his next words carefully. "Julia, I'd like to make you an offer, not as a housekeeper, not to clean or do chores. I want to hire you as Gabriel's companion, someone to be there for him not as an employee but as, I don't know, like a big sister maybe? Someone he trusts, someone he likes having around." Julia was speechless. "Mr. Miller, I don't have the training for that." "You have something much better than training," Robert smiled for the first time since the conversation began. "You have genuine love for my son, and that's worth more than any degree. Naturally, the salary would be much better than before. Enough for you to help your mother with the medical treatment she needs and still have a decent life here in New York." "I don't know what to say." Julia could barely speak through her tears. "It's everything I wanted, to be able to help my mum and be near Gabriel at the same time." "Then say yes." "Yes, of course, yes." Robert stood up and extended his hand to Julia, sealing the deal with a handshake that was much more than a work contract. It was the beginning of something new, a family reforming itself around different, truer principles. The following days brought profound changes to the Miller mansion. The first was the atmosphere. Robert gathered all the staff and announced that the old rules no longer applied. No more forced silence, no more isolating Gabriel. The house was to be a home, not a hospital. The staff, initially wary, slowly began to relax, to smile, to interact normally. The sound of conversation and laughter once again echoed through the halls. The consultation at Mount Sinai revealed important things. Gabriel did, in fact, have profound congenital deafness, but it wasn't irreversible as Henry had always suggested. A cochlear implant could restore a significant portion of his hearing, especially since Gabriel was still young and his brain retained enough plasticity. The doctors also treated the residual inflammation in the ear that Julia had started to address, confirming that removing the blockage had been necessary and had been done carefully enough not to cause damage. When Robert told Gabriel about the possibility of the implant, he expected anxiety or fear. Instead, the boy took his notebook and wrote something that surprised his father. "Can I think about it? I don't have to decide right now." It was the first time anyone had asked Gabriel what he wanted, instead of just deciding for him. Robert hugged his son, a long, tight hug, and said he could take all the time he needed, that this decision was his, and whatever he chose would be respected. Gabriel decided to get the implant, but not right away. He wanted to wait a few months to enjoy, for the first time, a life without constant treatments, without weekly doctor's appointments, without the pressure of always trying to be cured. Robert agreed, realizing that this break was necessary not just for Gabriel, but for both of them, they needed to learn how to be father and son before they were patient and guardian. Julia brought her mother to New York 2 months later, setting her up in a comfortable apartment that Robert insisted on paying for as part of her benefits package. Mrs. Davis, with access to quality doctors and proper treatment, began to recover. On weekends, Julia would take Gabriel to visit her mother, and the boy loved the simplicity of the small but warm home. There, Mrs. Davis taught him how to make cornbread, told him stories of Millersburg, and treated him like any grandmother would treat a beloved grandson. Robert began to participate more in Gabriel's life. He cut back his work hours, delegated more responsibilities, and prioritized being present. He learned American Sign Language, not just the functional basics, but truly studied, practiced, and made an effort. The conversations between father and son, once rare and tense, became a daily part of their routine. Gabriel told him about the books he read, the games he played, his fears and dreams. Robert listened, truly listened, not in a rush to fix or solve, but just to understand. Robert's transformation did not go unnoticed by the mansion's staff. Maria commented one morning in the kitchen, "It's like Mr. Miller woke up from a 10-year sleep. He's finally seeing what was in front of him all along." "Sometimes we have to almost lose everything to appreciate what we have," Julia replied, as she prepared Gabriel's breakfast, including the star-shaped fruit he loved so much. As for Dr. Henry Wallace, the investigation by the State Medical Board uncovered a series of irregularities in his professional conduct, not just with Gabriel, but with other patients over the years. His obsession with his research had led him to prioritize data over people, results over well-being. His license was temporarily suspended, while the case was investigated further. Robert, despite the anger he had initially felt, decided not to press criminal charges, not out of pity, but because he didn't want Gabriel to grow up with that legal battle as part of his story. The boy deserved peace, not more conflict. 6 months after the night that changed everything, the Miller mansion was unrecognizable. Not in its physical structure, but in its essence. The windows were left open, letting in fresh air and sunlight. The gardens, once untouchable in their sterile perfection, now had a vegetable patch, where Gabriel planted tomatoes and lettuce with Julia's help. The living room that had never been used was transformed into a common space, where Gabriel worked on jigsaw puzzles with his father on weekends. The large second-floor library, which had been the first point of connection between Julia and Gabriel, remained one of the boy's favorite places. But it was no longer a solitary refuge. It was where Gabriel spent afternoons with Julia, reading together, she allowed to practice her reading, he following her lips and the text in the book. It was where Robert sometimes joined them, learning to appreciate stories he had once considered a waste of time. Gabriel was still deaf, but that was no longer the focus of his existence. It was just a characteristic, like the color of his eyes or his height. He made friends for the first time, neighborhood kids whom Julia and Robert invited over to play at the mansion. Some were hearing, some were not, but they all learned quickly that communication went far beyond spoken words. Gabriel taught his friends sign language, and they thought it was cool to have a secret language the adults didn't understand. The cochlear implant. Surgery was scheduled for the beginning of the next year. Gabriel had decided he was ready, not to stop being deaf, but to experience a new way of perceiving the world. He was curious, but not anxious. It was no longer about meeting others' expectations. It was about his own journey. Robert had, as promised, created a foundation in Gabriel's name. But it wasn't focused solely on medical conditions. It was a foundation dedicated to ensuring that children, especially those with special needs, were treated as whole people, not as clinical cases. That their voices were heard, in the broadest sense of the word. Julia became a member of the Foundation's board, bringing the perspective of someone who understood that the best treatments in the world were worthless without humanity and love. One Sunday afternoon, a few months later, Robert, Julia, and Gabriel were in the mansion's garden. The New York sky was surprisingly clear, blue and cloudless, a rarity in the city. Gabriel was lying on the grass, watching the clouds, while Julia wove flowers into a crown she would later place on his head. Robert was watching them both, a soft smile on his face, when Gabriel turned to him and began to sign. "What are you thinking about, Dad?" Robert thought for a moment before replying, his hands forming the signs he now commanded fluently. "I'm thinking about how I almost lost you because I was blind to what really mattered." "But you didn't lose me," Gabriel signed back. "You found me. We found each other." "It was Julia who found us," Robert corrected, looking at the young woman who had become an essential part of their lives. Julia, realizing they were talking about her, looked up from the flowers and smiled. "I just opened a door. You two were the ones who decided to walk through it." "The most important door anyone has ever opened for me," Gabriel signed, getting up and running to hug Julia. Robert watched the embrace between his son and the courageous young woman who had dared to defy all the rules to do what was right. He thought of Marina, his late wife, and how happy she would be to see Gabriel like this, surrounded by love and happiness. He was sure that wherever she was, Marina knew her son was finally getting what she had always wanted for him, the chance to simply be a happy child. That evening, after Gabriel had gone to sleep, Robert called Julia into his office for a chat. The young woman entered with her usual curiosity, sitting in the same chair where months ago she had received the offer to become Gabriel's companion. "Julia, I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened," Robert began, "and about how your courage changed not only Gabriel's life, but mine as well. You taught us that true love doesn't calculate risks, doesn't measure consequences, it just acts when needed. Mr. Miller, I just did what anyone with their heart would do. No, Julia, many people would have followed the rules, would have kept their jobs safe, would have chosen not to get involved. You chose differently. And for that," he slid an envelope across the desk, "I want to give you something." Julia opened the envelope with trembling hands and found property documents. They were the deeds to the apartment where her mother was living. "Mr. Miller, I can't accept this." "You can, and you will," Robert interrupted gently. "Your mother needs a safe home while she recovers, and you need to know that your family is protected. This isn't charity, Julia, it's gratitude. You gave me back my son. There's no price that can pay for that, but I want you and your mother to have security." Tears flowed freely down Julia's face. "Thank you isn't enough. There aren't enough words." "Then don't say anything. Just keep being who you are. Keep taking care of Gabriel with the same love and dedication, and know that you will always have a place here, not as an employee, but as family." Julia nodded, unable to speak through her tears. She stood up and, in a spontaneous gesture that surprised them both, hugged Robert. It was a hug of gratitude, of mutual recognition, of two people who had found redemption through a child who just needed to be loved. The months turned into years, and the story of the Miller mansion became known in certain New York circles, not for the scandalous details, which Robert kept private to protect Gabriel, but for the transformation it represented. Stories of how a powerful businessman learned to prioritize what truly mattered, of how a young woman from a small town with no training or resources changed everything with courage and love. And, most importantly, of how a deaf boy taught everyone around him that true communication doesn't need words, only a heart. Gabriel grew up in a completely different environment from the one he had spent his first 10 years in. He developed into a confident, happy child, surrounded by love and genuine opportunities. The cochlear implant, when it was finally done, brought sounds into his world, but Gabriel never stopped using sign language. He said it was his first language, his true way of expressing himself, and he didn't want to lose it just because he could now also hear. Robert, transformed into the father he should have always been. He learned that success wasn't measured just in signed contracts or constructed buildings, but in his son's smiles, in late-night talks about dreams and fears, in simple moments of human connection. The company continued to thrive, but now Robert knew it was just a means to a life, not life itself. Julia never left the Millers' lives. She grew up alongside Gabriel, more like a big sister than a caregiver. She studied pedagogy with a specialization in special education, funded by Robert, and became a respected figure in her field. But she never forgot where she came from. The lessons she had learned in Millersburg about simplicity and genuine love. She married a few years later, a sign language teacher she met during her studies, and Gabriel was the ring-bearer at the wedding, proud of his Julia, who had saved not just him but an entire family. Mrs. Davis, fully recovered thanks to proper treatment, moved into a small house near the Miller mansion. She became a constant presence in Gabriel's life, the grandmother he never had, with stories of the countryside and cornbread that made the mansion smell like a real home. Robert loved when she visited, bringing a simplicity he had learned to cherish. The foundation Robert had created grew and impacted hundreds of children, ensuring that none went through what Gabriel had. Medical treatment with humanity, respect for children's choices, support for families struggling to understand special needs. Julia ran the practical programs, bringing her lived experience, while Robert secured the resources and structure. Dr. Henry Wallace never practiced medicine again. The investigation revealed so many irregularities that his license was permanently revoked. Robert learned years later that the man had moved to rural Vermont, where he lived quietly, far from the spotlight he had once sought through his research. There was no satisfaction in that news for Robert, only an emptiness for the wasted opportunity. Henry could have been a brilliant doctor if he had kept his focus where it should have been, on people, not on data. A decade after that night that changed everything, Gabriel turned 20. The mansion was full for the party, not the kind of ostentatious social event Robert used to throw, but a genuine gathering of people who loved this extraordinary young man. Friends from school, teachers, Julia's family. From Millersburg, classmates from the architecture school Gabriel was attending, members of the foundation. Voices and signs mingled in the air, communication flowing in multiple forms, everyone understanding one another. Robert watched it all from a corner of the room, a glass of juice in his hand, a smile on his face. Julia approached him, now a woman of 32, but with the same light in her eyes she'd had when she first arrived at that house. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how much everything has changed, how much I've changed." "You allowed yourself to change. That was your greatest courage." Robert looked at Gabriel, surrounded by friends, laughing at something someone had signed. "You know, Julia, sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come to work here, if you hadn't had the courage to do what you did that night." "Someone would have eventually," Julia said modestly. "No," Robert disagreed gently. "Not just anyone. It had to be someone special, someone who could see past the appearances, past the rules, past the fear. It had to be you." Gabriel saw the two of them talking and came over, making his way through the guests. When he got close, he wrapped them both in a hug, one on each side. Then he stepped back and began to sign, his hands moving with grace and precision. "I want to thank you both. Dad, for learning to truly see me. Julia, for teaching him how to see. And most of all, for teaching me that family isn't about blood or contracts, but about choosing to be there for each other every single day." Robert and Julia were silent, too moved to respond immediately. Then Robert signed back, "We're the ones who should thank you for giving us the chance to be part of your journey." "It wasn't a chance," Gabriel replied with a smile. "It was a choice, just like it was Julia's choice to help me that night, even knowing the risks. Choices define who we are more than anything else." The party continued late into the night, full of joy and celebration. When everyone had finally gone home and the mansion returned to silence, it was no longer the oppressive silence of the past. It was a peaceful quiet, of a contented home, of a complete family. Robert went up to Gabriel's room to say good night as he had every night for 10 years, and found his son already in bed flipping through a photo album. "Can't sleep?" Robert asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. Gabriel showed him the album. They were old photos, some of when he was a baby with Marina, others from his early years. But the ones he was looking at were more recent. Gabriel, with Julia in the garden, Gabriel and Robert building an architecture project together, the whole family gathered at Christmas. "I was just thinking about how things have changed, how life can surprise you." "True," Robert agreed. "Sometimes the best things that happen aren't what we plan, but what we never imagined was possible." "Julia once told me that love doesn't need sound," Gabriel said, and signed simultaneously, his voice clear and well articulated after years of speech therapy. he had chosen to do, not because someone forced him, but because he wanted to. She was right. Love makes itself felt in so many ways, in care, in presence, in small gestures that say more than words ever could. Robert felt tears burn his eyes. Your mother would have loved to see you like this, Gabriel. So strong, so whole, so happy. I know, Gabriel smiled. And I think she does know. Wherever she is, she knows I'm okay. That finally, after a long time, we're all okay. Father and son hugged, a long embrace that spoke of the entire journey they had traveled together, of all the suffering they had turned into growth, of all the pain they had converted into wisdom. When they separated, Robert kissed his son's forehead, wished him good night, and left the room. In the hallway he found Julia, who had come to check if everything was all right before heading to her own apartment. The two stood there for a moment in comfortable silence. Thank you, Julia, for everything. Thank you, Robert, for letting me be a part of this family. And so, in the quiet of that New York night, three people whom life had brought together in an unlikely way found their rest. A father who had learned that love doesn't control, it only accompanies. A woman who discovered that courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. And a young man who had taught everyone that silence, when filled with true love, can speak louder than 1,000 words. The Miller mansion was no longer a gilded cage, a monument to control and perfection. It was a home, simple and complex at the same time, where imperfections were accepted, where mistakes were lessons, where the most important thing wasn't how much you had, but how much you loved. And within those walls that had once echoed only with forced silence, there now resonated something far more valuable, the soft music of a family that chose every day to rebuild, to reinvent, and above all to be present.